Welcome to another episode of Conduct Detrimental. I am Dan Lust with Dan Wallach this week. The Dans are back in town. Dan, how was your weekend?
It's still Sunday night, Dan, so I'm hoping for a rally over the next couple of hours. But so far, it's so good. You know, it was a split weekend for the Rangers. They lost Friday, they won Sunday afternoon. So hope is still alive, and they're it's been a really interesting playoff run. But all in all, things are good.
We had a busy episode in the world of conduct this past week. We had two shows that came out. And then this weekend, Dan, let's just say when you have kids, I think the weekends are actually busier than the weekdays. Long gone are the days where I could sleep in, just take a dog for a walk. That was the extent of my day. Now it's absolute chaos. We got birthdays left and right, music class, soccer class. And so sometimes as crazy as it sounds, Dan, some days I wait for the weekend to be over so I can go back to the weekdays, as crazy as that sounds. But Dan, we're going to try to just cover one topic on this show. We're going to be joined by a very good friend of both of ours, Darren Heitner, who is in the sports law space. You guys have definitely checked out Darren on social media at Darren Heitner. We're going to be talking about the Jimbo Saban comments, where we go from there in the NIL front. Two topics that we're not going to hit today that we are going to cover on our show, Bench Points with Colin Farrell. Colin's been doing a great job over there, so certainly check him out. Separate podcast feed for Bench Points. But we're going to be covering the U.S. Soccer CBA deal that was basically put wraps on the settlement that was reached back in February. They had to come up with some type of equal pay CBA, which they've come to terms on. And so they're going to cover that over there, as well as the updates on the Deshaun Watson front. Namely, that there are reports that the NFL is circling July as the date that they will figure out whether they're suspending him or not. So we'll cover those on Bench Points. Definitely check him out and check out the show over there. We have a quad box this week, Dan, 2v2, a little bit of tag team action.
Yeah, we have a brewing story that we're both going to be following. It looks like the walls are beginning to close in a little bit on Daniel Snyder's tenure as the owner of the Washington Commanders. There have been reports from Pro Football Talk and some other sources that the owners are beginning to count votes, that it's almost like all of these issues that continually surface with Dan Snyder are like 1,000 cuts of death. And if it's not one thing, it's another, and it's just never ending. And it could very well be that the issue over the latest harassment allegations, could prove to be his demise. So that's a story we're going to be watching closely over the next couple of weeks. And it wouldn't surprise me if we devote an episode very soon to that.
It's never ending speculation that Dan Snyder is going to lose his team, but we can only hope.
Where there's smoke, there's fire.
Let's hope.
There's never been, not rooting one way or the other. It doesn't look good for his long-term sustainability, given everything that's been happening, and there's no end to it.
I'm happy to root for it, Dan. I'm happy to root for Dan Snyder to lose his team. I'm certainly happy. As I've said before, Dan, you and I don't know. He gives Dan a bad name. I just don't think he should be allowed to own a team and be named Dan.
I don't have any stake in it, but looking at it through the lens of all these legal issues and how the other team owners just might have had it up to here with them. I think the reason they did the $10 million fine without any oral or written report was someday in the future, well, they might lose their team that way. But I think at some point with Snyder, I think he's crossed. It may not be any one of these disputes standing alone, but it's just the sheer number of them without any cessation in that activity. So I think we're going to be talking about a lawsuit brought by Dan Snyder to try to get his team back in the year 2023. But this might come to a head in the next few months.
A reminder before we get to Darren, our podcast is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. So I have a feeling if you are a fan of the Washington Commanders, your team might not be playing all the way into the playoffs. So why not play on Underdog Fantasy? They have best ball format. That means you can draft a team now, and basically the higher scoring player gets to be put in your lineup. You don't have to go back and forth on your bench. But fantasy season is upon us. Underdog is the place to do it. Use our promo code CONDUCT for special match bonus. Again, that's promo code CONDUCT on Underdog Fantasy. Okay, Dan, so let us move over to the biggest controversy in the world of NIL. Nick Saban woke up on Tuesday. He went to an event in Alabama at Birmingham. I spoke to one of my friends, Dave Schultz, over he does sports radio in Birmingham, and his take on the Saban situation. And I guess we'll get into it. Saban's at basically an event for boosters and donors to the university. And I guess there's a lot of media at the event. It looks like there's cameras up, and Saban just goes off. And if you look at the comments in their entirety, I think there's a 7-minute video out there. that, I've tried to watch, I've tried to send to people who are looking for the exact comments. But it looks like if you take the comments in their proper context, I think there's a read on the situation where Saban is saying, hey, we finished number 2 in recruiting. And that might be, not great, but we finished number 2 to the team that cheated, right? That's paying their recruits. But who is he telling that to, Dan? He's telling that to a bunch of Alabama boosters, right? So maybe that's his way of saying one of two things. Either A, they only beat us because they cheated, or B, we need to fight fire with fire. If they're paying their recruits, we need to pay our recruits. So, Dan, I don't know. What do you think about that theory? I've seen that floated out there, that he was actually telling the boosters that they need to start doing what Texas A&M was doing.
I don't think he needs to be that overt with it. A lot of that stuff can occur behind the scenes. So I think he was just answering a question, to be quite honest. So much of this deal making and strategizing is really not for public consumption. So I don't know what I would read into it other than he was just asked a question, and he's a pretty candid person, and he can be very outspoken at times. He doesn't hold back. And he's shown that in a number of other scenarios and in other contexts as well. So I think maybe these statements are being blown out of proportion. But what's more notable to me is the overreaction, from Texas A&M. I mean, it's like they doth protesteth a little bit too much. So it's their response that jumped out more so than it was Coach Saban's initial comments.
Let's talk about that response, because that's also part of the story here. Saban went off, and we'll talk about it with Darren. Saban obviously teed off on Texas A&M. That was the big scorn of his comments. He also said that Deion Sanders paid Travis Hunter, this big defensive back that was committed to Florida State. He basically said that Jackson State had to pay him $1 million to switch, which I don't know if it's true or not true. He said it. And Deion Sanders responded that Nick Saban was telling a lie. So, Dan, maybe there's another topic for you and I down the road, a defamation lawsuit by Deion Sanders. He also touched upon John Ruiz at Miami, which Darren, I think Ruiz is a client. He has some affiliation with Ruiz, but we're going to talk about that. But the big one here is certainly Texas A&M. Texas A&M is a very big power within the SEC. And so the comments from Jimbo Fisher, he goes, I'm announcing an emergency press conference. I think he said 10 a.m. the next day. So Jimbo gets up. Jimbo used to be on Nick Saban's staff over at LSU. The quote that got a lot of attention, this is a quote from Jimbo Fisher. Some people think they're God. Go dig into how God did his deal. You may find out a lot of things you don't want to know. So the implication is that Nick Saban has a lot of skeletons in his closet, that Nick Saban basically lives in a glass house. So he shouldn't be, putting himself in a position to having rocks thrown at him. So, Jimbo, I think, felt as if Nick Saban called him a cheater. Nick Saban then felt compelled after the Jimbo comments to come out and basically say that he, didn't intend that. Quote, I really wasn't saying that anybody did anything illegal. I didn't say that. Quote, I should have never singled anybody out, and I apologize for that part of it. Quote, collectives are the issue. If alumni give money or money is raised through a collective to be used to give to players, that's no different than the alumni giving player money. Alumni is a representative of this school and can't do that. So, Dan, you have Saban apologizing and also trying to not apologize to make sense of his comments. What'd you take of Saban's, response to the Jimbo call out? I don't know what to call it.
You know what, Dan? I'm surprised that we even have devoted an entire episode to the back and forth between Jimbo Fisher and Nick Saban.
Hey, you got to read it.
Honestly, it's not that big of a deal to me. I think it raises a lot of larger issues about collegiate sports, where we're headed next. But there's just going to be, more of these accusations because coaches are going to be posturing to try to gain a recruiting advantage, or when they don't have a good recruiting season, to blame other forces, nefarious forces, for why they didn't recruit so well. So these are two of the highest profile coaches going at it over some of these themes. And this won't be the last time that happens. So I don't know. It's just difficult for me to get real worked up about this. This is not, I never thought we would have like a National Enquirer or TMZ type of, podcast episode, but I think it does nip at the heels of some of the tensions on the periphery of college sports right now that have been sort of at the surface over the last couple of months since NIL became part of the marketplace, and boosters and alumni have been really beginning to push the envelope with the scope and magnitude of some of these deals. This was all inevitable. You could take Fisher's name and Saban's name and put in some other coach next week and some other rival coach. There's going to be more of these discussions and accusations going forward. They're going to multiply.
You know what's funny? This is I think you said something similar when we did the Evander Kane series of episodes that the TMZ feel you didn't love. I mean, maybe my wife watches all these housewife shows, these different shows. There is some inherent drama between the two. Two of the biggest coaches in the SEC going back and forth. But Dan, to your point, I mean, I like the gossip and the drama of it, but let's talk about where it goes, right? And this is why we have Darren on. I think there's a world, and I asked him about it, but I think there's a world where two coaches of their stature going back and forth is just bad for the sport. I think, I can make an argument that NIL is good for the sport. It's good for the athletes. But when these two coaches, these two heavyweights of the sport are going back and forth and making it seem like these players are cheating, that's bad for the sport. And maybe this is the tipping point that forces the NCAA. So I don't know. I'd love to get in the weeds here, but maybe it's relevant.
Quotes and public statements don't really wind my watch all that much. Lawsuits, litigation, enforcement actions. I mean, we have a legal affairs show. We cover the intersection of sports and the law, and it's hard for me to get into the drama and the emotion surrounding what this coach said versus what that coach said. What is interesting to me is where this leads to.
We did promise we have Darren Heitner joining the show. The biggest story in our sports law world, I don't think anyone can contest that, I think is really what's going on in the NIL world, really on a week in and week out basis. So without further ado, let's kick it over to our conversation with Darren Heitner. Darren, welcome to Conduct Detrimental, or should I say welcome back? It's been a minute.
It has, but it's always a pleasure to join. Thanks for having me.
So certainly a big story in the world of NIL this week. We thought it best to call you. You are the guy for this. So yeah, obviously we've been speaking about it, but Jimbo Fisher, Nick Saban, Deion Sanders, John Ruiz, all of the big names that have been at the center of NIL are involved in this story. So what are your thoughts, I guess, when you saw the Saban news and then, obviously the Jimbo emergency press conference? What were you thinking about as that came across your ticker?
I was shocked in general. I mean, first of all, I don't necessarily think that this was a strategy, that Nick Saban was doing this and speaking with the intention of his quotes getting out there and being published extensively, thereby causing someone like Jimbo or Deion Sanders to react so prominently and publicly as well. I do believe that Nick Saban had the intention of speaking very clearly and forcefully to a specific segment of individuals who have the capacity to really provide resources that Nick Saban and the University of Alabama are seeking. And obviously, the University of Alabama and Nick Saban have felt very threatened by what has been the reshaping of the balance of power among college programs, and specifically college football programs. You look at a school like Texas A&M, where Jimbo Fisher is the head coach of the football team, and you see a program that has been very lackluster for quite some time. Yes, it did succeed in victory against Alabama, but for that victory, Texas A&M does not have all that much to brag about in the recent past. And all of a sudden, in this new era of NIL, Texas A&M is signing this five-star athlete and that five-star athlete and just completely dominating the recruiting landscape. And I think that absolutely threatened and continues to threaten Nick Saban, Alabama, and other major programs that have, at least in the recent past, more traditionally received these five stars. So I do think Nick Saban was basically calling out two boosters, two donors, and saying, we need to do something about it. And by using Jimbo Fisher's name, by using Deion Sanders' name, I think it was a real call to action. And look, my reaction to Jimbo Fisher was just complete surprise. He was completely transparent, calling out Nick Saban, to the extent where the SEC commissioner even had to get involved and tell both Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher, cool it down.
Yeah, but this, Darren, this kind of reminds me of the Bum Phillips quote. I don't know who he said this about, but, he could take his in and beat yours in, or he could take yours in and beat his in. Isn't Nick Saban still, sort of the king of college football, no matter where Texas A&M falls in the hierarchy of NIL, type deals? Alabama is still going to be king of the hill. So what's Saban's end game here? What is he hoping to accomplish? And do you think my statement's true, or has the balance of power now changed in college football?
Well, I think if we're looking specifically and strictly at monetary compensation, no one can argue with you. Nick Saban is absolutely still king of the hill. He is the highest paid college football coach. And while Jimbo Fisher has given him somewhat of a run for his money, he is also very handsomely compensated. Nick Saban's at the top, and that's not going to change in the near future. But I think even Nick Saban is not immune to feeling pressure, to feeling threatened, and perhaps to having his ego somewhat blemished. And to have just the utter domination. I don't think, maybe some people don't realize it, but it was true domination that Texas A&M showed on the recruiting trail this past year, just blowing away Alabama. And look, Alabama's going to be fine, as you mentioned. And Alabama will still succeed for years to come, at least so long as Nick Saban is there as the head coach. I mean, it has entrenched itself as a program, probably the number one program in the country, and will be there for a long time. But anything to threaten that status, I think will cause, and has now very clearly caused, Nick Saban to become very reactive. And that's why you saw those sound bites. And what's so interesting is thereafter, after Jimbo Fisher most prominently responded, and Deion Sanders, even though he said he was going to publicly respond, seemed to do so through a journalist. You saw Nick Saban take a step back. And I don't know if you call it an overt apology or an indirect apology, but it seemed as though he was at least saying that he was sorry. I don't know if that's him or his publicist who's telling him to do so. I always thought when I first heard that his soundbite, I'm like, oh my God, doesn't he have to film an Aflac commercial with Deion Sanders? Like, they just went to war. But again, to your point, yes, I think whether there's a transfer window, whether there's NIL, Nick Saban is still at the top, and he will probably be at the top until the day that he retires, which may not be so far from now.
So, Darren, as everyone that's listening to this knows, you are one of the main NIL guys in the country, and obviously the NIL guy in the state of Florida, as you helped create the law over there. So, a guy, we talked about Deion Sanders, how Saban brought him up. Obviously, Saban talked about Jimbo Fisher. The quote from Saban about Miami, he goes, "These guys at Miami that are going to play basketball there for $400,000, that's in the newspaper. The guy tells you how he's doing it, but the NCAA can't enforce their rules because it's not against the law." So it goes on. So the comment was obviously about John Ruiz, who's, a very wealthy and a big supporter of the University of Miami. I'm not sure call him a booster or not. Then obviously Ruiz fires back. He thought that comment was about him and basically called Saban like a whining teenager. So, I know that you're very understanding of what's going on in Florida, and in particular, John Ruiz. What are your thoughts on Saban's comments toward Ruiz and Ruiz's response, and maybe how Miami and Ruiz fits into the NIL picture?
Well, my first reaction about Saban's comment is it seems as though it's the pot calling the kettle black. If you think back to the beginning, right around July 1, 2021, you heard Nick Saban come out and applaud his quarterback, Bryce Young, publicly, talking about how he's already received over $1 million in NIL deals. So here's the guy who really started the trend of being very public about these NIL deals and trying to use them to his and his program's advantage, to now either directly or indirectly complaining that you have someone like John Ruiz, a very wealthy, well-to-do individual in Miami who is absolutely a supporter of the University of Miami and has opened up his wallet. And I should be clear, he's not only doing deals with University of Miami players, but that is the primary focus for him. And it seemed as though, and it seems that Nick Saban is visibly, audibly upset with that for some reason. He says that what John Ruiz, and again, without specifying it was him, but people can connect the dots, that what he's doing is not something that the NCAA can enforce. And what's interesting about all of this, and it's not just John Ruiz, but it's also the claim concerning Deion Sanders. It seems as though Nick Saban in his commentary wasn't even operating off of any evidence or facts. When he's talking about someone at Jackson State earning upwards of $1 million, he's relying on, I think, commentary that was initially published on Twitter relating to Barstool that was never verified. And in fact, you had the player come out and tweet something along the lines of, well, that's news to me. My mom is still in a house with like 3 bedrooms and 5 kids to them, something along those lines. And then the same is true with regard to John Ruiz. You can criticize him as much as you want if you're not a Miami supporter. But where's the evidence that he's actually done anything wrong, that he's done anything to violate Florida's law or the NCAA rules? Now, the NCAA did recently come out with new guidance that seeks to further clarify the very simple NIL policy that it established in July 1, 2021. But it's still not even clear under that guidance that there would have been any violation. And in my conversations with John Ruiz, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who cares more about the specifics of laws and rules. I mean, the guy is meticulous. So the last thing he wants to do is violate anything, nor put any of these players in jeopardy.
Darren, so many of these deals are becoming more aggressive. And while they may seem, or at least on the surface, seem to comport with legal requirements under state law and have some element of being, at arm's length, they all have the same common, origin of the money, and that they're coming from either alumnus, or boosters of the school. And it raises the issue of, fair market value, and would these deals even take place if it wasn't being funded by somebody with ties directly or indirectly to the university? So are we about to enter this new legal frontier where the aggressiveness of these deals is going to lead to a tipping point where there's some type of either pushback from the NCAA, or this is just going to end up in the courts? Because clearly this is beginning to look more and more like true free agency rather than the original intent behind NIL laws, which was to allow athletes to earn money for the use of their, name, image, and likeness, to be able to do endorsement deals that reflect their earning, potential. And now we have some of these team-wide deals, school-wide deals. They're going up in number, and they all have at the funding point some connection to somebody who went to that school.
I think the answer is both. I think it starts with NCAA enforcement, and a byproduct of that will be litigation. It's very clear from what we heard from Gene Smith, who said when this new NCAA guidance came out that the NCAA is expecting litigation. And the other thing is, why even come out with any guidance? Why focus on the recruitment of what the NCAA calls prospective student athletes, or really high school athletes who have not yet enrolled at universities, as well as athletes who are in the transfer portal? Because while the NCAA initially established really 3 main criteria. 1, there must be quid pro quo, which gets to your commentary surrounding fair market value. 2, there cannot be any sort of inducement in exchange for enrollment at a university. And 3, there can't be pay for play. Well, the problems with 1 and 3 are that how are you really going to determine whether there is fair market value? As long as there's some minimum quid pro quo involved, I would very strongly argue that passes the smell test for number 1. And then number 3, pay for play, as long as you're not making payment in the future contingent on some sort of future action or inaction, which also means not pulling the money away if the player's injured, then you're not going to be able to prove that. So it all boils down to number 2. Inducement for enrollment. And again, that's a high school athlete or somebody who's in the transfer window. And that's where I think the rubber's going to meet the road here. That's where you're going to have the NCAA start to try to enforce its rules, probably look at some of these collectives and individual boosters who are offering upwards of $8 million to athletes before they're enrolled, and take action. And then, as I mentioned, the byproduct of that will be litigation.
Okay, well, that's a great point. But why can't we also examine fair market value if players are being paid these excessive amounts, or there's little to no differentiation between, the star quarterback and the sort of the special teams player or guy who does the wedge block? If there's little differentiation between how different players on the team are compensated, doesn't that presumptively, create a notion that there really isn't any fair market value if they're all being paid the same. I mean, I'm just choosing team-wide deals by way of example. Who should make that determination, and what criteria should be utilized? Should there be some independent, body, an arbitrator? If these issues come up, who gets to make that decision, and how do you determine what's fair?
It's an excellent question. And I think the question provides the answer, which is right now, there is no independent body who would make the determination. And there's not even a body within the NCAA who actually has the experience, knowledge to provide this type of answer. Consider that the enforcement division of the NCAA is understaffed. Are they now going to all of a sudden create some new division with resources that they don't have and find experienced people to make these determinations? Of course not. If we go back a year and a half, the NCAA was toying with the idea of creating a third-party administrator to do just this, and it decided to scrap it.
Yeah, but they've been effectively, sort of neutralized or rendered, completely ineffectual by virtue of their fear of antitrust litigation. So wouldn't it be incumbent on the NCAA to have like some kind of a test case to at least test the limits of their authority? Because essentially it's open season, and these collectives and alumni and boosters can do any kind of deal they want without being checked by the NCAA, which is afraid to take action for fear of being sued. So what can the NCAA do to at least create some kind of throw down a gauntlet and just prevent this from being the Wild West?
Yeah, I think if it's smart, it picks and chooses its battles very wisely, and it doesn't focus on that fair market value criteria. Realize, going back to July 1, 2021, after toying with that third-party administrator concept, it scrapped it altogether. There's no mention of fair market value July 1, 2021. Where you do see it come up in certain places is within certain state laws that were passed. But then if you even look at those state laws, there's also no enforcement mechanism. And we haven't seen any of those state laws even attempted to be enforced in roughly 12 months now, since those laws have become effective. So I think if the NCAA is going to wisely pick and choose those battles, it's going to focus instead on the fair market value. It will focus on the inducement to enroll. And it can look at Exhibit A would be the example of the high school quarterback from California who was provided an NIL offer that goes up to $8 million from a collective that has a mission tied to the success of the University of Tennessee. And soon thereafter, the quarterback committed to that school. I think that's what set off a lot of this. It was reported in The Athletic. It spread like wildfire. You now have a lawyer who represented that athlete saying he has a spreadsheet of athletes he can't keep up with who are doing deals left and right like this, and that the collectives are paying him to do these. I think that's what the NCAA is concerned about, and that's where they're going to take action. And then you may have lawsuits based on antitrust against this.
So just as we close this, Darren, I mean, I saw your comments on Twitter about this attorney who shall remain nameless on this podcast. At least we don't want to give him additional business, but he's kind of trumpeting that these NIL contracts, they don't have the school attached. I just, to your point, Darren, like, I think there's a messy world at some point, something's going to happen where someone is paid a certain amount of money to attend a school. And if truly these contracts aren't tied to actually going to that school, it's just kind of like, hey, I'm giving you this money with the expectation that you'll go. You could start to see a really messy service, type services contract. So, certainly the NCAA is not in the business of policing NIL contracts. There's no like salary cap. There's no, someone looking at all these deals on the NCAA level. But, as we kind of, finish this and we let you go, I'm just kind of left, and I'm sure, Dan, you're wondering, and Darren, like, is this the tipping point, right? Is this the time that the NCAA, federal government, somebody steps up, or, are we going to keep going down this road and maybe see, a really messy lawsuit between maybe an athlete and a collective, as opposed to like a collective suing the NCAA? This athlete collective business, I'm with you, Darren. I'm if you have these shady characters and these, contracts that kind of are bizarre, it's not really a good world. It's not setting up, these nice, clean, easy deals.
From my perspective, until the NCAA actually takes any action based on its original rules and now its newer guidance, we're just going to see more of the same. And in fact, it may be enhanced. We're going to see the existing collectives who have been providing major offers and boosters to these athletes continue to do so. And we're going to see the mimicking game being played. We're going to see collectives that are either already formed or in the process of being formed. I mean, you don't have a collective tied to universities at every single school just yet. They are still being formed. And I think you're going to see the pooling of resources to a greater extent and more of these types of offers being made unless or until the NCAA takes action. Dan, to your question about federal action, I've been following Congress very closely on this issue. They seem to be completely disinterested at this point in time. Over the past 2 years, I think roughly 10 pieces of legislation have been drafted and sponsored. Not one of them have made the House or Senate floor for debate. We've seen, I think, 3 to 4 congressional committee hearings where all that the legislators want to do is hear themselves speak about when they were in school and the sports that they played, and constantly getting sidetracked and off topic. We've seen these individuals take an issue in NIL that was completely nonpartisan, or call it bipartisan, in the 24 states that very quickly passed this type of legislation and make it very split among party line. And where it's been completely conflated from not just being about NIL, but also about revenue sharing and health and safety and antitrust exemptions and preemption and so on and so forth. I just can't see Congress getting its stuff together and deciding we're going to prioritize this over everything else that's happening across the world and all of our other domestic issues that we're facing. So I think it's going to be left to the NCAA. I don't think states are going to enforce their own laws against their own schools. So it's a wait and see. What will the NCAA do? When will it occur? And what will be the reaction?
I think that's a fitting point to end our conversation on. Darren, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure we'll be talking again once the next NIL hammer drops. Thank you very much, Darren.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Great catching up with you again.
So that was Darren Heitner, sports law professor at Florida, and someone who's been very involved in the NIL space since day one. Dan, I think we hit about everything that we wanted to go over this week. Certainly, we'll see what comes up on this NIL front. Dan, anything to add before we put this episode in the books?
Not really. I thought that was an issue worth covering because, it sort of reached a boiling point in the world of NIL this week, and Darren has been at the epicenter of all of it. So he was a perfect guest for this episode. And looking ahead, I think this is the week of Gruden versus the National Football League. That's going to go to oral argument on the
Bauer
motion
versus
to dismiss.
Major League Baseball as well.
Yeah, so we got a couple big legal stories we're following in the week ahead. So, I know I'll be personally tracking the Gruden versus the NFL oral arguments, which are, I think, going to be very important outcomes, both as it pertains to Dan Snyder down the road, because we may find out through the discovery process whether and to what extent he played a role in the, release of these emails. And it could also have some bearing on the arbitrability of the Brian Flores versus NFL legal dispute. That's why I believe the Gruden case is a preview of some of the bigger stories that are going to come down the pike in some future litigation.
We are live on location at the Canuck Bar on 9th Ave at New York City event. The bar is giving us our drink tickets for our fun night. And we should mention,
why are we getting drink tickets, Dan?
yeah, Steph, you've been very quiet. Who is giving us drink tickets?
Well, none other than Themis, the best bar review on the planet. So far, we've got a 1-for-1 track record for conduct detrimental.
Yes.
I know Terrence's doing Themis. He's taking the bar soon. Everyone that listens to conduct detrimental better be using Themis. That's all I can.
The higher brass at Themis is here tonight. So they're going to show you that Themis is the best. I mean, they make bar prep fun. And they're going to make bar night fun. How do you like that?
Okay, Dan, I think this episode was good. Yeah, if anybody has any topics they'd like us to cover, they'd like to cover for our website reminder, conductdetrimental.com. For Dan, myself, everybody here at Conduct Detrimental, we will see you next time, another episode. kind of detrimental.